The following is a production of the Dallas Genealogical Society. For more information, please visit our website at dallasgenealogy.org.
I'd like to call up Sue to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Barry. Grace Horstmann is a graduate of the National Genealogical Society Certificate course in Advanced Genealogical Skills and multiple writing courses at the Salt Lake Institute of Genealogy. A genealogist, historical researcher, writer, graphic designer, and copy editor, she has devoted the past decade to the study and documentation of family history. Her specializations include Midwest and French genealogy, with additional research experience in the southeastern United States. She's particularly skilled in the demanding work of navigating unindexed records, reviewing them page by page with precision and care to identify the correct individuals among countless similar names. Beyond the analytical process, her professional passion lies in interpreting and transforming those findings into compelling narrative histories. These works are crafted with the dual aim of captivating readers and maintaining uncompromising factual accuracy. Each story she produces is grounded in rigorous documentation, yet written to convey the texture, complexity, and humanity of the past in a way that resonates with both genealogists and general audiences. Welcome, Grace.
Thank you. All right. Good morning. It's so good to be with you all. I can't wait to share with you one of my genealogy passions today, sharing your ancestor story in a format which will interest even your most uninterested family members. So today I'm going to discuss how to use 5 easy steps to build out your ancestor's life in a way that is not only interesting to your readers, but also factually accurate with details that can absolutely be cited in your favorite Tom Jones or Elizabeth Shawn Mills source citation format. So the first thing to remember is you can write. Don't let anyone tell you that you can't. I would have once said that I could not write either, but in taking this class, you're all going to get to benefit from one of the very best English teachers of all time, the same one who taught me to write. That's my mom. I can't boast about that. She's my mom, but seriously, she taught me how to write, and today I'm going to pass on what she taught me to you. So my first piece of advice is going to be really simple. If you want to write, you have to be a reader, and you have to read widely. You can't write about the way your grandfather's farm in Virginia or your great uncle's ranch in Montana looked if you've A, never been there, or B, you haven't read up and studied these areas until you know them like the back of your hand. If any of you read the story that I released for you to read beforehand, it may interest you to know that the seed of that story came from a single line in a newspaper stating that Charles Fortin came home from college. I never even knew he went to college until I saw that. There was no details. I had to read all sorts of books and papers, articles, all sorts of things, go and visit the college just to get the level of detail that turned that statement into a story that would interest people, especially, I think we all know a lot of the younger generation doesn't tend to be interested in it. And they don't tend to be interested in historical stuff in general. And we want them to be able to catch our passion for learning about history. So that's what I'm going to tell you guys how we can do here. Sorry, just a second. So here's the 5 points in my writing process that we're going to work through in our time together today. You're going to select a scene, sense the setting, study the situation, shape with specifics, and speak in their style. So selecting a scene. So there are so many places that you can start with choosing an event to write about. And here's a list of some that I've compiled. You do not have to choose one that's on here. I mean, every family story is different, but you can choose a birth, an emigration. You can choose a place. You can write about your grandfather's farm at a certain time or season. You can write about a typical day in your ancestor's life. I know Sue and I both took Karen Stanberry's course on writing, and she had us write about a specific day in our ancestor's life, which was not something I had done before, but it is an interesting format to try to write about, especially if you don't have a lot of what people would call like a writable events in their family history. You can do a relationship moment, or there may be a time when you write about a brief period of time in your ancestor's life. You don't have an exact date, but an exact date may not always be available. So you can write about a brief period of time as well. So the first thing you want to do is narrow your focus. That's the primary. Too many people try to cover a whole life or multiple generations in their family tree in one story. We obviously want to write about all the stories in our ancestors' life, but it's more manageable and more powerful when you're doing descriptive writing about their life to break it up into smaller events. You zoom in on a single moment, and then you add those together, and it builds up to a bigger story. And it's easier to write. You're not overwhelmed by trying to fit in every detail that ever occurred in your ancestor's life. And the other thing is, it does not need to be a dramatic occurrence. So many people think, well, I need to have my ancestors, my ancestor who foiled the bank robbery, or my ancestor who was in a train crash. It doesn't need to be a big event like that. And there are so many little things in our ancestor's life that you can write about that will actually be something that your reader can identify with more. And I mean, by all means, if you have a dramatic occurrence, you can write about it, but you don't need to. And if you want to cover a slightly larger portion of an ancestor's life, break it up into scenes. Like if you're going to write about your ancestor's immigration, break it up into scenes. Like this first scene is traveling to the port of immigration. The second scene would be choosing the ship or train or whatever mode of transportation they used. And the third scene would be the voyage or the trip. This will work much better, and that you can find that much detail to put into each of those scenes that will turn them into a good story. So my case study that I'm using, this is the story I gave you guys beforehand, but we're going to work off that. So if anybody didn't get to read that beforehand, you can go back and download it and read it later, but we're going to be using some examples from that. So in 1893, my great-grandfather, Charles Fortin, attended college for one term at Greenville College. I'm not wanting to write a full novel on his life, but this is a brief period of time in his life that I've selected out of many different threads that I could have drawn from this brief section of narrative. I can enrich this section with more detail and turn this into something interesting, something that, a lot of people will be interested in someone's college experiences, and we can make that into an interesting story that even somebody, if I was to tell them, oh, he was born at this time, and they'd be like, yeah, okay, who cares? But this is like a story that they will want to hear about. So the next thing we're going to do is use our 5 senses to rebuild the scene. So the 5 senses are a crucial part of building out your story. Once your topic is chosen, you can unlock the potential of your scene by walking through it using each of the 5 senses: sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. Now, not every scene is going to use all 5, but most of them will offer at least 3 if you think about it deeply and creatively, and probably more, but at least 3. And you have to remember the time period is crucial here too. You can't assume that the same things you smell today in the city are the same things that they would have smelled today or smelled 100 years ago in St. Louis or Chicago. So that's something we want to think about when we're considering using the 5 senses. And we'll get into those more in just a minute here. Now this, you guys can, anybody who's online can screenshot that, or you can take a picture of that, but these are all places that will enhance your sense of sight in a story. And you may be wondering how would you use that? Well, you can look at their online profiles and search for an item, a place, a thing, a ship, anything like that. Pictures can help you describe something in your story without making assumptions. So my great-great-grandmother came up the Mississippi River from New Orleans on a steamboat called the Alex Scott. Now I know what steamboats look like. And in researching it in the newspapers of the day described it as a sumptuous floating palace. I mean, I have a idea that it must have looked pretty magnificent, but I don't know what that meant. So I went looking for pictures of it. Well, their steamboat pictures are hard to find in the first place, and this particular one didn't seem to have any pictures. But then as I was going through and just searching all these different places looking for pictures of it, I found one of the only pictures I ever found of it was in an 1862 issue of Harper's Weekly. Because the boat was being used in the war. But I did find a picture of it, so I can describe accurately what it looked like from the outside, without making an assumption that it looked like every other steamboat you see, or, paintings of steamboats. Some more thoughts on the sense of sight. You want to use common sense in it. Some things will not have existed in your ancestors' time period, and we know that by research. So if you had a great-great-grandmother who lived in Massachusetts in the 1830s, I mean, obviously we know she won't have seen a television. I don't think most people would assume that she saw a cowboy, but there's some assumptions people would make. And a lot of people think, 1800s, Victorian time period, she probably wore a hoop skirt, one of those big full skirts. Well, no, she didn't. The hoop skirts actually didn't come around until the 1850s. So she didn't have one of those big full skirts. And, we also make assumptions about what people didn't do that aren't necessarily accurate. In the 1830s, macaroni and cheese, which we think of as something it's something from today, that was a popular food in the 1830s because Thomas Jefferson popularized it from France. So she could have eaten macaroni and cheese. That's something we don't think about. Search for historical books or photographs of a specific place or surrounding area. There are series of books on Amazon or other online bookstores that are just picture books, photographs of certain areas, certain that the compilers have collected them over the years, and they've compiled them into picture books of a certain area. So that can give you clues. When you're using Sanborn maps, use the keys and think about. Don't just assume, okay, so you're going to think, well, my ancestor owned a business on the courthouse square. And so you're going to probably assume, well, he probably had, maybe you've been to the courthouse square today and all the buildings are brick around the courthouse. And so you will think, well, my ancestor had a brick building. Well, that may not be true. His building could have been wood, could have been stone, it could have been brick. But then if it was brick, what color was it? Because we think of the normal red brick we use today, but brick came in red and gray and white. Research the area. My family came from St. Louis, and St. Louis was renowned for brick production. And in areas like the St. Cecilia Historic District in St. Louis, They took their bricks and glazed them white. It was called bakery brick, and they used it to create intricate patterns with red brick in their buildings. So don't make the assumption that you know what it looked like based on today's surroundings or just on your own viewpoint of what something looked like. For country landscapes, a visit to the area is unparalleled. But if you can't do that, and not all of us can, you can try to put into a Google search the area name and then add landscape photos. And then if you click on images, you can browse pictures of the landscape and study it for details. Most landscapes haven't changed that much, even if the buildings on them have. Again, use common sense with that, like the Johnstown flood in Pennsylvania that changed the area. So you can't go and assume that what it looked like today looked like what it did in the 1850s in that area. For a city, try searching the city name and the street if you're fortunate enough to have it, plus the date, like a time period in a Google search. Like as an example, search Los Angeles Sunset Boulevard 1904 photos, and again, go to images, and there are tons of things that will come up that will work more in the cities. Most small towns, that's not going to work, but cities that will work. If you have a direct address, try searching for the address of a house, and a real estate listing will probably come up for it. Now, that's not entirely foolproof, but if it's an old home, like look at it. If it says it was, so you know your ancestor lived there, you know from the census that your ancestor lived in that house in 1920. Well, if you go to the real estate listing and it says it was built in 1899, then that's the house. That house that's there is the house that they lived in. Now, it could have been redone, but a lot of old houses, especially Victorian ones, still resemble in structure outwardly what they looked like when they were built. So that's a way to get maybe some ideas for the outside of the house. Search, don't ever make any assumptions that you won't find something. You search for ship names, place names, lighthouse names. Anything could come up. Add the date, definitely double check it. Like when I had my great-great-grandmother came into the port of New Orleans, in her diary, which I have, her friend's diary actually, he mentions the name of the steamboat or the tugboat that pulled them into the harbor. I just, on a hunch, ran the name of the steamboat through, and lo and behold, there's a picture that comes up of that tugboat. So I can use that picture in my story, and it's just in the year that she came in. So it's an accurate picture. It's not changed or anything. So I can use that. So don't ever assume that you won't find something, that your person is too obscure, anything like that. Search for it and see what you can pull up. Search occupations for a time period. You may find photos depending on, past 1840s and 50s, earlier than that, probably not. But again, like woodcuts and stuff can give you ideas for pictures that can help you with that. So we're going to move on to sound. So sound, these are examples of things that my Charles Fortin, in my story, could have heard. He was a farm boy from Bond County, Illinois, and these are things that as he left his home on the farm and moved into town, these are examples of things that if you think about, he probably heard. This was in 1893, so these are things he would have heard in that setting and at that time period. There's another print. This is another slide. Again, you can take a picture of this one. This is for audio. This will help you think about how to describe sounds. Like again, if you read my story beforehand, it mentions a buzz saw in the story. And I remember when I showed it to some other people that story, they said, well, I don't think that they would have had that back then, and they did have it back then. It's a different tool than what you think of today when you hear it. And I have actually found a link to a video on YouTube where a historical society has an old one that they did a video of, so you can actually hear what your ancestor heard without assuming that what you hear today when you think of that is what they're talking about. By using that, you give your story a I'm there, I can hear what they were hearing sense. So feeling is another one. So as you're working through your senses, you think about what would he have felt? What would they have seen? What would they have felt? And so, the jolting of the buggy on the rough country roads. Roads are still rough out there. The crisp night air, the weight of firewood, the feel and the dangers of utilizing the buzzsaw. He would have known all about that. His brother almost cut his leg off using a buzzsaw, so he was quite aware of the dangers of using that. Smell and taste. Now, this is probably the most too difficult to work with. We're used to imagining in terms of sight and sound and maybe feeling, but we aren't usually used to imagining in terms of smell and taste. Like, if you envision your mother's wedding, you probably have seen a picture maybe of her wedding day, and so you can probably imagine the color and feeling of her wedding gown. You can probably, if you think about it, you can probably imagine the sound of her shoes as she walked up the aisle, but you probably have never imagined what her bouquet smelled like. Was it peonies? Did it smell like that powdery sweet smell, or were they carnations that has a spicy clove scent, or maybe like the jasmine vanilla scent of stephanotis? You don't imagine things like that. And did you ever try to imagine the flavor of your mom's wedding cake? Probably not, but that's my point. We don't tend to imagine in that way, but it can be done, as I'm going to show you here. In my story, these are examples that I used in that story that I shared with you. So when you think about it, it was autumn. There's, from the newspapers, I know activities that they were doing. For taste, I have authentic memoirs and diaries of the students at the college that talked about foods that were eaten at the college. So it may be more difficult to do that, but, and like I said, these are the two that, depending on what your story is about, they may not be as relevant to your story, especially taste, but it could be. So try to imagine that and think about that. So moving on to studying the situation. So this is using adverbs to enhance your writing. Now, we all know the adverbs from school. Those are all familiar to us, but most people don't imagine those as playing a major role in building an interesting story. So we have, sorry, one slide too far. How, when we talk about our ancestors, it's easy to slip into just listing what they did. When we pause and ask how they did it, the picture becomes a lot richer. The pace of movement, the strain of their work, the emotions behind an action, all of that helps us to see them as real people, not just names in a story. When you think about the difference between a stonemason's work or a banker's work, they're both workmen, but the level of what they did and how they did it was a lot different. So the words you choose matter here. A simple shift in description can change the atmosphere completely and give you insight into their character. You start to capture the feeling of a moment instead of just telling us what they did. That's what really humanizes an action. It lets you connect with who your ancestor was and how they related to the world around them. It's the difference between recording history and truly experiencing it. So then we've got why. Once we've thought about how someone acted, the next natural question is why. Why did someone stay in the old country, or why did they leave the old country? Why did they risk an ocean voyage? Why did they, endure traveling across the prairie to California? Someone say something? The how gives us the texture of their action, but the why takes us deeper, pointing to the forces, feelings, and motivations that shaped their lives. Asking why is what transforms your list of events into a story. It takes you from simply recording their actions to exploring their motivation. Did this ancestor make these choices in their life based on duty or love or ambition or fear? Were they fleeing persecution? Were they, did their, intended spouse move to America and so they followed them here? Or did they want to get rich quick going to California? The records rarely tell us why someone did something, but the context and patterns can give us clues. So the why invites you into the private world behind the public record. Then once we've thought about why someone acted, the next step is to ask when. Choices don't happen in a vacuum. They're tied to a moment in time, a season, a stage of life. When places your ancestors in a moment in history. It gives a scene texture, whether it feels heavy with endings or alive with beginnings. When you pay attention to time, you're setting a mood for the story. A story that occurs at daybreak is going to feel a lot different than a story that takes place in the dead of night. And if you read fiction, that's the type of thing that people pay attention to. Sunny days give a different atmosphere to a story than a cloudy day does. Nightfall, daytime, spring, summer, winter, they all give an emotional bent to the story that helps you to bring out your theme in the story. So a record can give you the year, but finding out exactly when gives you the feeling behind the record. Where grounds a story in space. So that tells, when we know where it happened, a specific room, a specific field, a specific street, when you know where someone was standing or sitting or moving, it's not just geography in the story. That helps you to place an example in relationship and perspective. Like when I was writing about Charles Fortin, I have been out to where he lived, but looking at a map, I can see the direction that he would have traveled, and I know what specific roads he was on, and I know what streets he went through, and I know where his farm sat and what creeks they crossed. And so knowing that type of stuff helps you to, it's not just he got in the buggy and drove from here to there. I can say, I know he got in the buggy and he drove east 2 miles and crossed the creek, which had no bridge. So that's going to add a whole bunch of details and texture, sound, all that to your, if the creek is stagnant, it's going to have a smell to it. If it's fast running, there's going to be a feel and a sound to it. So that's where it really opens up your choices for details. Then the last adverb is to what degree. It's about, asking that question helps you to figure out the intensity and scale of the action you're talking about. When we talk about, your ancestors' crops failed, was that a passing setback in their life, or was that a devastating loss? And a certain year that might have been a passing setback. In the 1930s in Oklahoma, that was a devastating loss. Most people moved because of that. Was their seed journey uncomfortable when they immigrated to America, or did they almost die? Was it an almost unbearable trip? This is especially powerful when you're writing because records don't tell you this stuff. You have to read between the lines. By considering the degree of effort or struggle involved, you get a clearer sense of these people's character. Like as an example, there in researching one of my family members in Illinois, they had a friend who lived next door, and I've read the friend's diary, and this friend came to America, their family got sick, and several times they talk about they're going to go home, they're going to go home, they're going to go home. They almost go home, they pack up to go home, and then eventually they stay. So eventually the desire to stay in America won out over their frustration with the setbacks that they experienced. But at the time, that seemed almost unbearable to them, and they wanted to go home. So when we think about the intensity of the struggle or the effort involved in this, and the story you're trying to tell, then it really helps you to, again, find detail for the story. And you have read or might read in that story that I shared you, there was a setback in Charles's desire to go to college. And it could have proved to be a devastating setback. It didn't, but it could have. So that's the type of thing I'm talking about. So then we're going to move on to the adjectives. And again, that's something most of us are going to remember from school, probably better than the adverbs, but like adverbs, and maybe even more than them, they're major weightlifters in our writing. So the adjective questions are what bring color to your story in the best way possible. Now, these are going to require research, but these are going to be worth it. So we're going to explore each of these briefly. So asking what kind sharpens your focus. Instead of leaving something generic, name it more precisely. So your ancestor lived in a house. Okay, what kind of house? Was it a log cabin, or was it a weathered farmhouse? Was it a Queen Anne Victorian house? They came over on a ship. Was it a steamer? Was it a schooner? What type of ship did they come over? Because that has lots of implications on how you write about that. If the ship was 2-masted, 3-masted, square-hulled, brig, all those types of things are major detail-oriented things that have a major effect on your story. Tells you about function, style, and status. It adds cultural precision. Clothing, tools, even the way we describe people. All those things take on more life when you identify what kind it was. Some things you're not going to be able to identify the clothing brand your ancestor wore unless you have the piece of clothing still. But you can generally identify the certain things, like if you have the name of a ship, you can look it up and you can find out what type of ship was this. So instead of just saying ship, okay, it was a schooner. Now I can describe how many masts it had, how many sails, what shape it was. So with just a few words, you can move your story from something forgettable to something memorable. The what kind question turns flat words into pictures, which shifts our history from broad strokes to fine detail. Which one? This question is about choice, selection, and focus. It narrows it when there are many barns or many fields or children, choosing which one to tell your reader about gives the scene clarity and direction. It helps you see what mattered to your ancestor. The detail you choose to highlight reflects your point of view as a writer. What college? College is a general term. If I told you my ancestor went to college, that doesn't tell you anything. Greenville College in Bond County, Illinois is very specific, and it's a very different college from Harvard or Clemson University. These choices bring specificity to our writing. So you're not going to just generalize and say, oh, we went to college. Well, this is what college was like. No, this college was a different type of college than some other colleges he could have gone to. How many? The question, how many? This, we naturally wonder about quantity, and this is a simple question, but it can change a lot in your story. One stone in your story, if your ancestor's moving one stone, that's manageable. If they moved out to Wyoming and before they could plant their field, they had to clear the field of thousands of stones, that suggests labor and time. And storytelling, the choice between an exact number and a loose phrase like a handful, a pair, it sets the rhythm. Sometimes precision, an exact number, 353 immigrants on a ship that was only supposed to carry 212. It's best for pulling the reader in. It means that your ancestor was definitely crowded on that ship, while vagueness invites imagination. If you say the field was covered in stones, either way, quantity adds detail to your story. It shifts the story's scale. It gives you an indication of how hard the work was that your ancestor was doing, or how hard or easy their life was. And then what size or shape. So numbers don't tell the whole story. If you ask what size and shape, a single massive block of stone is a very different reality than a pile of small rocks. Size and shape adds to the how many question, and you need both to bring a scene to life. The most important one in the adjective question, though, for our writing tends to be what color, texture, condition, and this is the sensory powerhouse of your writing. Color and texture are the details readers remember most. Was the quilt faded rose or indigo? The boots cracked and caked with mud? Was the tablecloth freshly starched, or was it stained and threadbare? You can suggest use, value, age, hints at economic status. If somebody's coat is threadbare, it's hints at their economic status. Describing texture like a burlap sack, a smooth river stone, a greasy iron stove, splintery wood, activate your reader's imagination. Like the fields surrounding the Fortons farm, a patchwork of russet, gold, and green. So you get that picture in your mind, and it really draws you in to think about the beauty of that surroundings and what it looked like. In another story I wrote about an ancestor who was a stonemason in antebellum Virginia, and he built a mansion out there, which is still standing. The area he was in, I researched the sandstone he would have used, and it's Ridgely sandstone. That's a white sandstone that sparkles with yellow sparkles from iron oxide. So I could just blandly write that he built a sandstone mansion, or I can use that detail, a sparkly white sandstone, to bring the wall the man built to life in real time. So some things to remember for that. Some of the questions, you may not use some of them will overlap. Always do your research. So don't just think, I know what this was like. If you had an ancestor who served in the War of 1861 to 1865, if he was on one side, most people are going to assume he wore a blue uniform. If he was on the other side, people are going to assume he wore gray, but that may or may not be true. Union soldiers primarily wore blue uniforms, yes, but there was all sorts of different colors and shades, especially early in the war, from like leftover styles or state militia styles. The Southern Army was even more. Cadet gray was their official color, but they had butternut brown, unbleached white. That was the ghost regiments. Early militias wore dark blue and light blue. How's that for mixing up your ranks? Special units like the Zouaves had vibrant red, yellow, and green uniforms. Morgan's Raiders wore black uniforms, and some officers had like orange and violet trim on their uniforms. So don't just assume, oh, my ancestor served on that side, that's what color he wore. And you have to research what regiment was he in, what would he have, and like, I found this picture on the internet that shows you just a sampling of some of like the Union uniforms that were so different that you assume you know what they looked like, and you may not know everything about how they looked. This is the last step here, and I think it's the most important in this type of writing. You need to learn that your ancestor may not have spoken in the way that you speak today. I grew up in the Southwest for a good part of my younger life. My mom and dad both grew up in Illinois and St. Louis. We don't talk the same way. I call that nut that I referenced at the bottom of the slide, I call that a pecan. My mom calls it a pecan. My mom calls a carbonated soft drink pop. I call it soda. So you get my drift. People from different parts of the US, not to mention the world at large, say different words to mean the same thing. I don't know if anyone in this room is from Illinois, but if you aren't, how many of you probably know what a crick or a codget is? In Southern Illinois, you would know what that is. It's a creek is a crick, and a codget is a cat. If you were from Oklahoma and someone was to ask you for a cup of Arbuckles, you would pour them coffee. But if you were to ask a person from Maine for that, they would probably wonder if you're all right upstairs. Most people are not going to know what that means in most parts of the US, but in a certain part of Oklahoma, they do know what it means because that was the coffee brand that was popular there. So how can you find the way that your ancestor probably spoke? So one thing to think about is you have to think about where your ancestor originally came from. So if your ancestor was living in Texas, but he immigrated from Germany, he's going to speak like a German. His children will probably have a mixture of German and English, and his grandchildren, more than likely, not all the time, not saying to, apply this as a hard and fast rule, his children will probably speak the Texas dialect of English. So that's the first thing to remember. Now, when you're thinking about where can you find the way that your ancestor talked, there's a whole list here, and we're going to go over some of these in more detail. Regional diaries or dictionaries and linguistic atlases. The first one is the biggest one. That's the one I use a lot, the Dictionary of American Regional English. We'll get more into that in a minute. There's linguistic atlases, online dialect databases, occupational and trade-specific glossaries, manuals and trade journals, look at material culture, museums, local newspapers, look at the ads, the classified society columns, look at Chronicling America, Genealogy Bank, diaries, letters. Now, those are going to be good for, especially if your ancestor had a specific thing that they said that maybe other people didn't say. That's going to be a good one to use if you have them. Regional and occupation specific personal writings. Try Archive Grid or Hathy Trust. Idioms, sentence rhythms, those are all going to be in there. Oral histories, WPA narratives, contemporary or near contemporary fiction. And I will tell you more about that in a minute because but those are, if you can find an author from the time and region, you can get a lot of style and dialect and vocabulary from those. Folklore and proverbs, travel accounts and gazetteers. Just one second. So environmental and topographic descriptions, like naturalist journals and environmental histories, think like John James Audubon's diaries and stuff. If you have an ancestor from that time period or that place, that's going to be helpful to you. historical recipes and domestic manuals, material culture language. Again, this code switching and hybrid speech, that's what I was talking about, the second generation from the immigrant, their children are probably going to speak a little bit of both. And so they'll have, and I have a friend in Brooklyn, New York that said that's true. The Jews up in Brooklyn, New York, they do have a blend of Yiddish and English that they speak that is different. So you're going to want to think about that. Ethno-linguistic patterns like Creoles, indigenous inflected English, linguistic studies from immigrant communities. All of those are going to be helpful if they're for your ancestor in their area. You're going to find those are helpful for figuring out the language from their area. So the Dictionary of American Regional English, that is going to probably be the best one if you can find it. I think you can get it at a lot of universities. It's very expensive online. It comes in 5 to 6 very thick volumes, and it can be hard to find. Supposedly it can be accessed on Internet Archive, but Internet Archive was down when I tried to go back and check that. So I don't know if it's on there or not. I'll have to see if it is. It said it was on there, but I don't know if it is anymore. A lot of local universities have it. It's one of the best available resources. There's a specific dialect for every area. So you aren't going to want your ancestor talking like a New York banker if he was a farmer from Tennessee or a mine owner in New Mexico. Like the example I have here on the screen is the word creek, and it tells you that in some places, it tells you how that word is said in different places in the country. And the word creek, if you look at down at the bottom, it'll say chiefly inland, north, middle, west. They'll say crick. Remember, I told you in Illinois they say that. So it tells you, and that map will show you. That's the word crick. Well, that map shows you in the north. People say that a lot. If you're from the south, people aren't going to know what you're talking about. It's very rarely used in the south. Occupational and trade specific glossaries. So in 1875, a farmer would use a steel moldboard plow for tilling, a scythe for hand cutting crops, a seed drill, and a threshing machine. If you're talking to about a 19th century sailor, he's going to speak about the scuttlebutt for water, a belaying pin for securing lines, a bosun's chair for climbing the rigging. So you want to make your ancestor speak his language. So I've talked about my ancestor who was a stonemason in Virginia, and in searching around on the internet, on Internet Archive, I found a book called Practical Masonry, A Guide to the Art of Stone Cutting, comprising the construction, setting out, and working of stairs, circular work, arches, niches, domes, vaults, tracery, windows. The title goes on from there. But that book was written in his time period, and it was published in Virginia. He probably used that book. And so I can use that to find specific terminology his trade would have used that we may not use in our ordinary language. But using it for him puts him in perspective as the man that he was, a stonemason in Virginia. The local newspapers are a treasure for finding this stuff. In 1897, my great-grandfather, Charles's father, wrote a blistering column in the local paper, which frankly I didn't understand. He was talking about how he used the term how the mossbacks butchered the goat and we're going to be making a trip upriver for 4 years. I asked the local genealogist, what in the world is he talking about? And the local person said, well, maybe he was a member of a fraternal order, but he wasn't a member of a fraternal order. I know that. The religious community he was associated with would not have allowed him to be a part of a fraternal order. So I did a little research on terminology, and as it turns out, he was a hardcore Republican. William McKinley had just won the presidency, and so he was essentially mocking the local the other side who had lost the election using the political terminology of the time. But it sounded so weird. I was like, what in the world is he talking about? So that's language from the time period that you can use, and it will help you to give more detail to your story. Now, I mentioned the fiction. The names on the slide are people who, these are just people that I've used or read, and they lived in the area they wrote about at the time they wrote about it. So when you read these people, you're going to get the specific dialects and regional customs and things like that for their area, because they wrote about the area that they lived in the time that they lived there. So it's a fun way to get details for your stories, but you also have to be careful with it, because there are many novels that were written about a place that were not written by a person who lived there or in the time period that they lived there. A novel can have been written in the time period and not the place, or the place and not the time period. It's the combination time and place that are the most important, because otherwise a person can write about something that they may never have seen. There's a famous example of that is Uncle Tom's Cabin. The writer did not live there, and that was why nobody's saying that what she wrote wasn't true, but that's why a lot of people criticized her, because they said, well, you've never seen it. And that's the thing. You want to find a person who wrote about the place where they lived in the time they lived there. Use a specialized thesaurus. The book, The Thesaurus of the Senses, that's a great one. Mark Twain said the difference between the almost right word and the right word is the difference between a lightning bug and lightning. So using different words enhances the verbal impact of your writing by adding richness, precision, and variety. When you carefully choose words that fit the tone and context of your story, your message becomes clearer and more persuasive. Varying your vocabulary also keeps readers engaged, particularly readers who are not too interested in the historical or more genealogy terminology that we use. So repeating words can make the writing flat. So if you vary it, it can make it more engaging. Also, different words carry different shades of meaning, so you can use them to express emotion or emphasize points or create imagery more effectively. If you say, the man walked into the room, you don't really know how did he walk into the room. If you say he shuffled into the room, you get the impression he doesn't really want to be there. If you say he trotted into the room, well, he's in a hurry. If you say he dashed into the room, well, you definitely know he's in a hurry. So it gives your writing depth, and it allows you to connect with your audience. These are two really good books that you can use. This set of books that you can buy on Amazon are really good. The Writer's Guide to Everyday Life. The people who wrote these are historians that have done research. There's actually 9, but I can only fit 7 on here. It goes all the way from, I think, the Middle Ages all the way up until World War II. They give a lot of good insights into different time periods on a variety of subjects. I use the first 2 the most, but there are several others for different time periods. They cover everything from food, transportation, etiquette, terminology, housing, military, money, a lot of things like that. This was a picture that I took from the 1800s one that's talking about carriages, coaches, and wagons. And it gives you descriptions of all these different, what they looked like, where they came from, who used them. From a picture that I have and comparing it with this book, the 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 buggy that my Charles Fortin used when he drove to college was probably what they called a covered runabout. So you can see there, that would be an interesting type of a useful resource in writing about things. Remember that if you can't prove something with a source, then use words of probability. Everything cannot be proven without a doubt when we're talking about history. Like, I cannot say that Charles ate beef and cabbage at college, but diaries from students who went to the school at that time say that that was often served. So I can say that since that's a high degree of probability, I can say that he possibly or presumably ate beef and cabbage. Can I say that he was stepping on dried leaves near the college steps? I don't have any source that says that. I don't have a picture that shows that. I do have a picture of the college at the time, and there were huge trees all over the college lawn. It was autumn. I know that the weather had already turned cold from the weather reports in the newspapers in the area. So I can say that almost certainly or very likely he heard the crunching of dry leaves, and you can add these details to pique your reader's interest. Final tips, keep a writer's word bank by time period or region. Most of your ancestors came from Illinois in the 1850s, or that's the time period you're working on, keep a bank of words, a Word document, something like that, of words that you find in that region that they might have used. Don't try to do all the questions that I've given you at once. Work through them one at a time. Remember that this is the way I write. There are lots of kinds of writing, and it may work for you or it may not. You might adapt it. Maybe you like to read that way, but you don't like to write that way. Don't force it. Practice it, but don't force it, and it will start to come naturally. And remember, don't stress out about it. Writing is supposed to be as fun for the writer as reading is for the reader. So I'm at the end here. So I want you all to, hopefully I've encouraged you all to want to get writing. I hope I've shared my passion with you and that you want to go out and start writing directly. Is there any questions, or does anybody have any questions about it?
Paul, let's start with you online if you have any online questions.
There wasn't any
Okay.
questions, but there was a really, you made it probably into the Zoom, the Dictionary of American Regional English, a link for that. And then some other things that came across that was very interesting, like the radio show that Tony, you mentioned, the waywordradioshow.org. Pretty interesting. I'm going to have to check those out. So thank you for sharing. But we don't have any questions per se online. Oh, we do have one from Laura Hendrickson. Do you want to unmute yourself, Laura?
Sure, yes. Hi, Grace. Thank you very much. I enjoyed the presentation. I'm really interested in this idea that you have about, regional dialects and certain terminology. And I'm curious, I just was thinking about where are the places you would use that? Is it just in dialogue, or are there other places that might come into play?
Well, no, see, in dialogue, it is important, but the fact is if I'm writing about a scene in Texas, and I'm going to, if I'm talking about a person out in Texas and I'm talking about the landscape out in Texas. Now, I know this from having lived in Oklahoma. They call shallow gullies out there washes. I'm not going to call it a gully in that story. I'm going to call it a wash because that's the place I'm writing about. That's the terminology that people in that area would have used. And, if you want to explain that to a reader who may not know what that is, you can do that in an endnote or a footnote. But I think that it makes the story like you're there, that's how people would talk. That's what you would hear if you were in that area. People would call it a wash. So I think it's not just dialogue. I think that it's important as a whole in your writing. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Tony, or back to you at the library.
Okay. I was just wondering with the advent as we continue to get into AI, and obviously there's a lot of issues in terms of writing and perfecting your writing, et cetera. What are your thoughts about how that aspect of it is going to change possibly the way people are writing the stories or pulling that information together?
Okay, so I think AI can be a useful research assistant. I do not like the way it writes at all. And I have a problem with using AI writing and I'm passing it off as my own because it doesn't feel like it came from me. And I don't know where it came from. It could have pulled together 100 different, people's. So I don't like using it for writing. And I don't think it writes well. It sounds stilted to me, but I do think it's a very useful research assistant. So when you're trying to find something out, particularly like that newspaper, when I said I didn't understand the political terminology, I asked it if I have an ancestor who used this terminology at this time in this place, what was it likely talking about? And then it pulled it up and it said, well, it's probably political terminology. And then I said, where did you get that from? Give me a source that would tell me that that's what, how do you know that that's what it meant? Because you don't want to trust it's a robot. You want to know what you're being told. So then it pulls the sources and I can look and I can see, oh, in the political columns here or in a political column there, they were using that same terminology. And I can assume, okay, so I find that 25 times mentioned in a Chicago newspaper in the political columns, it's probably political language. So it's a very helpful research assistant if you don't want to have to wade through, 150 websites or try to read, 20 books on politics in the 1890s. It's a very helpful tool to pull things together. I think that's its main purpose. I don't think it writes well, in my opinion, and I can tell when it's been used. I think that the human brain was designed to write a lot better. So that's my opinion.
I have a question here from the Zoom land on, at least back with AI, picture generation or image generation, and the conversion of an actual photograph that's not very good or not very quality into like a pencil sketch or into something with more detail. Have you seen that being used lately?
I can show you where it's been used. So if I go back here, I will show you for just 1 minute. Hold on, just let me go back to that slide that it was on. That is a useful use of it. That right there is a pencil sketch. I could not get that picture any clearer. You see the one up at the top up there? I couldn't get it any clearer. And so I asked it to convert it to a pencil sketch. And I think it did a pretty good job.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's what I was.
Yes.
That's exceptional. And I think the
Yes.
same thing could be done, you think, with the ships that you were
Oh,
saying that.
absolutely. Yes, I do think it could be done with that. That's one place where it does a really good job. And I forgot to mention that. Yes, that is one place that I think it would be a good use of it because some of those pictures, they're not the best and they may not be the quality you would want to use. But I thought that the conversion it did for me there was pretty spot on accurate.
Yeah. I was thinking that also about locomotives of the time and the different sizes and shapes and different parts of the country had different types of locomotives and trains.
Yes.
Train cars,
Yes.
same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Wow, what a phenomenal presentation. Grace, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We really appreciated this and have learned so much. And really, I think this is a shout out to your mom, who clearly was a phenomenal English teacher, and we need more of them like her. So, just as a reminder that next month we will not be in this channel, in this that same bat channel, same location. We're going to be at our Preston and Royal Library. Please keep an eye out for emails and more information. And thank you so much for a great meeting. Take care, everybody.
All right. Goodbye.
Thank you.
This has been a production of the Dallas Genealogical Society. If you're already a member, thank you. Your fees have been supporting these and other society activities. If you're not yet a member, please consider joining now. Go to dallasgenealogy.org and click on the membership tab.